pushing a product where they were offering CDs that would have, you could pick a rate reset over 2 years. At some point you could say, I want to reset my rate. And the setup for the commercial is they said, okay, this is Thomas Sargent, most knowledgeable guy in the world on this kind of stuff. Professor Sargent, can you tell us what interest rates are going to be in two years? And can you give us some background on that? And he said, no. The basic idea is economics is not sort of a crystal ball. It's not, forecasts are probably only worth as much as the paper they're written on. So it's with that grain of salt, let's see what I've got to say. If Tom Sargent can't tell you what's going to happen, what can I tell you? I can do a little bit of telling you what has happened, right? So maybe that's a good place to start. So 2014 per capita GDP in the U.S. was $56,000. That was an increase based, the final numbers aren't out yet, but an increase based on the last estimate of about 4%. That's in real terms. So that's quite a bit better than we've had for quite some time. So that's a positive sign. In PA, the picture wasn't quite as good. Per capita income is $53,000, which is only about a 1% increase. If you look over a longer term, looking over longer terms, it probably makes more sense. Short-term fluctuations being what they are. Over the last decade, it hasn't been a great decade for sure. If you look at sort of what's been the rate of growth in the U.S., it's averaged about 0.5% per year, and that's primarily been driven by the recession. Right? So 2007, 2008 were particularly bad. On this measure, PA was a little bit better, right? A little bit higher growth over this period. Why was that? A lot of people kind of suggest it was because of the big boom in natural gas and things like that. It sort of smoothed out some of the other wrinkles in the state economy. So what's in store for 2015, right? Keeping in mind what Tom Sargent says, this stuff really isn't predictable. First, the good news. So Wall Street Journal every quarter goes to a panel of something like 35 professional forecasters. These tend to be, while they're economists, they tend to not be academic economists, depending on your perspective. Maybe that makes this better or worse. So these are guys who push out newsletters to investors and things like that. And the forecast consensus was that we should see in the next year about 3% real growth, right? So again, continuing this expansion of the economy. Consensus unemployment is the employment numbers are going to continue to get better, right? We've gotten down to 6%. The general consensus is we might get down as low as 5%. And inflation is still going to be sort of not a problem, at least based upon these professional forecasters. What's the so-so news? Virtually every forecaster suggests that wages are going to continue to sort of stagnate. Right? We haven't seen a lot of wage growth, even as the employment picture has kind of picked up. And why is this so-so news? Well, if you put that together, that wages aren't really going to go up very much, but inflation is going to stay well below its sort of long-term trend, that means that real purchasing power is going to increase, but not by a huge amount. There is also some discussion, these are averages, right? The medians are lower because a lot of these increases are concentrated sort of toward the high end of the distribution, and so that may lead to sort of some particular issues. But at least on the whole, these numbers are better than maybe we kind of expected over the last couple of years. But if you know economics is referred to as the dismal science, and that's not for nothing, right? We tend to be fairly dour folks. Everything about sweetness in life, right? If you've been paying attention, financial markets since the beginning of the year have not been doing so well, which is a disappointment given that sort of toward the end of last year, things really seem to be improving on that front. We got above 2,000 on the S&P 500. Things are going quite well. Why has this been? It's an interesting question for sure. If you listen to the media, you listen to KYW radio or whoever's the relevant local news radio station around here, they've got a story, right? Their story is like all about oil, right? Oil's declined pretty substantially in costs over the last number of months, and that's what the markets are picking up. If you think about this for a moment, you might scratch your head because you might recall back when oil was really expensive, the same outlets were saying, well, this is what's bad for markets, right? High oil costs are bad for spending. Now apparently low oil costs are bad too. So what's really going on here? There are, as I suggested, a pretty steep decline in the price of oil. So we go back from last August to essentially last week. We've seen a decline of more than 50% in the price of oil. Why is this? Right? Why is this decline, and why in the world would this have this effect on financial markets? As I said, again, you think back when gas prices were through the roof, everybody would say, well, this is going to be terrible for the economy too. And so really, what's the story? Well, the story that's told, there was just a New York Times article on this past weekend, the story that's told is basically, well, the markets are a little funny. It takes them a while to process information, and the first line information they see is low oil prices, that's bad for Exxon, and so we got to sell all the market, and the market's going to do poorly. And then over time, maybe the rest of the sort of secondary effects may come back, and so the markets may improve a little bit. There was also sort of a line in the New York Times article, and a lot of the discussions of this, is that markets in general don't like this kind of uncertainty. This seems a little bit funny. If you're an economist, you know much about economics. We know that while markets aren't perfect, they do tend to be what we call informationally efficient. It would be pretty dumb for markets, for professional investors, for arbitrageurs, to sit back and say, oh my goodness, this is going to be really bad for Exxon, but eventually it's going to be good for the economy, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sell the market today, and then later on I'm going to buy it. If you were a smart arbitrageur, you would start buying the market like crazy, right? If you thought that all these other dumb people were doing this stuff. And that's why we think markets are efficient. When people sort of make dumb choices, the smart money counteracts those choices, right? So these kinds of stories, I think, just don't make a lot of sense. And so what we want to really think about is, why is this effect occurring for real, not based on this kind of market mumbo jumbo? And when you think about why oil prices may have declined, there are two real possibilities, right? It could be supply or it could be demand. Everything comes down to supply and demand. So what's the conventional narrative? The conventional narrative is prices are coming down because there's been sort of new exploration of natural gas alternatives, fracking, things like that, new discoveries, developments of alternative fuels, things like that. There's an alternative, what I call a pessimistic alternative, which is global demand is declining, right? Oil prices reflect global demand. People use more oil and there's more economic growth globally. So if people think that global demand has declined, or people think that it will decline soon, that would drive down prices of oil, right? What would that also do to financial markets? Well, it's a good indicator of demand. That too would drive down financial markets. And that story makes a little bit more sense than the, oh my goodness, we're worried about Exxon, but we don't sort of recognize that everybody else's costs have suddenly gotten cheaper. And you might say that's a nice story, but you know, how can we really sort of sort that empirically? So one alternative is, let's look at other indicators of global demand that have no sort of relationship to increased natural gas discoveries or increasing fracking and things along those lines, but would also indicate some belief about what's happening to global demand. And here I just picked one copper. You could have done this with lots of other commodities. You can see roughly the same thing. Looks a lot like that graph earlier for oil, right? It's got essentially the same slope. It's picking up the same time periods. Maybe not quite as steep, but more or less it's telling the same picture. What is this possibly suggesting? Saying the world is kind of shutting down. Who's been driving copper demand over the last number of years? It's China, to a lesser extent Russia, places like that. They're also the ones that have been driving sort of global economic growth. This should be a very sort of worrisome picture for everyone. And I think that's really what the markets are kind of picking up. You may also ask, this is sponsored by a bank, so you may be interested in what's going to happen with interest rates. Remember Sargent's response, nobody knows. If he doesn't know, how do I know? That said, you know, if we weren't as smart as Sargent, but we just sort of relied on basic macroeconomics 101 training, pretty much every sort of thing that we've ever taught in economics in the last 40 years would have put together two things. Over the last number of years, the Fed's easy money policy plus increasing government spending should suggest inflation, right? If you've got an expectation of inflation, that means interest rates should go up. That story, while it's sort of textbook economics, maybe there's some counters to it. But here, if you take a graph of simply taking the spot market rates for futures contracts for interest rates, what you'll see is, and so that's after this break point here, this is if you take what futures contracts for interest rates are selling at right now. Right, so this is, if you go into the market and you say, I want to buy the guarantee that I can borrow at a certain rate at some point in the future. What do you notice? You notice at least those markets are suggesting, yeah, we should see sort of interest rate spikes, and it should actually happen pretty soon and pretty quickly and fairly dramatically. Now that too is, depending on what business you're in and probably from a general standpoint, this too is pessimistic. But now we come back to a little bit more optimism. Turns out that if you had run that same graph every day for the last 6 years, you'd have found the same thing, and yet interest rates haven't gone back up. So I think the punchline in all of this is we're in weird and interesting times, for sure. Not only does Thomas Sargent not know what's going on, I think none of us do, certainly on this particular issue. But I think I'm cautiously pessimistic. When people are cautiously optimistic, I'm cautiously pessimistic. I do think signs of global demand are suggesting sort of the increases are not going to occur. Even though sort of the end of last year gave us hope, I think there's some reasons to not think that. But who knows? Could be wrong, right? Thomas Sargent doesn't know. I don't know. Let's talk about some Pennsylvania specific issues, and then we can move off into the questions. These lower oil prices that I showed up there, in some ways are particularly bad for Pennsylvania, right? One of the things that has kind of smoothed over the general bad economic times that the rest of the country has seen. Some of the things that have smoothed those over for Pennsylvania have been sort of the natural gas boom that you've seen here. If oil prices have declined, that's going to affect that for sure. Something else that's potentially important for Pennsildania, there's a lot of employment in education and health services. Both of these industries are under big uncertainty, right? So for health, I'm sure everybody's been following in the papers, but the cases on Halbig versus Burwell and cases like that, throwing into question what's going to happen with the health exchanges and things along those lines. Pennsylvania's part of the national exchange. Right, so if Halbig would go for the plaintiffs in that case, that would throw that into uncertainty, right? The subsidies would be gone for Pennsylvania residents unless a fix was arrived at. Beyond that, there are some other deeper uncertainties, right? Pennsylvania derives a decent amount of its economic growth and force from things like pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry is scared to death about what's going to happen sort of long run with respect to the new ACA and things like that. Why are they scared, you may say? Doesn't this sort of lock in some demand? Wasn't that part of the fix that Obama came up with to get it all passed? And the answer is yes. They like the idea that they've got sort of more customers and sort of fixed customers with more money. However, they are worried about what's going to be paid for in terms of future product development, right? And what's going to happen to sort of profit margins and things like that. So I'm not saying that this is a necessarily bad thing, but I'm saying it's certainly an uncertainty. When it comes to education, education's a fairly important industry here in Pennsylvania. I think among private employers, my University of Pennsylvania is the second largest private employer in the state behind only Walmart. So it's an important sort of sector of the economy. Education's under a lot of uncertainty. It hasn't probably gotten as much news as perhaps the healthcare sector has, but it's gotten a decent amount of coverage. All this discussion of, well, what does college really get you? Well, what does all this spending get us beyond sort of debt and things like that? And there are these kinds of discussions of federal government has sort of come in and said, maybe we're going to start doing university report cards, and maybe we're going to condition federal aid on those sorts of things. The colleges are kind of a bit worried about this, and what that could mean for long-term employment is potentially problematic. At the end of the day, it's probably not going to affect places like the University of Pennsylvania, the places sort of the top end of the distribution. It's probably not going to affect so much the places that are cheaper, public schools and things along those lines. But the schools sort of in the middle, the ones that cost a lot of money but aren't sort of a guaranteed paycheck anymore, are really the ones that may end up being hurt balances. And so that kind of uncertainty has really limited hiring sort of at the university level in schools along those lines. And so that's probably not good news long term for Pennsylvania. Demographics and the fiscal situation in the state don't bode so well either. Right? Pennsylvania is among the states, the oldest based on median age. It's among the 10 oldest states in the country. And fiscally, it's also among the 10 states that have sort of the worst balance sheets. Right? So those are probably bad things. Again, I'm cautiously pessimistic. Could be wrong, but these are not sort of good forward indicators. Now, one bright spot, we had a little bit of a discussion about tourism and things like that. It's interesting, in September, the Pope will come to Philadelphia, and it's already estimated it's going to be about $500 million for 3 years. That's percentage terms, that's something like 50 basis points of the state economy. That's big for sort of 3 days. And it could even bleed over into the mid-states economy. Some of the websites that are sort of looking for, how can I get housing during this visit and stuff, have basically said, go all the way to Harrisburg, right? Because Philadelphia is going to be overrun. Right, so it's a small bright spot, but it's a bright spot nonetheless. So I'm going to stop there and we can